Oh God, as we gather in your name for this, we are grateful. We ask, O Lord, your guidance and your presence here as we study together. As always, what we're after is more than just learning. We're after an applied learning, reflective learning, to where what we learn becomes a means to an end. It is used in a way to bring about a change inside of us. So we give you our minds at this time, and we give you this whole space over this next hour or so in hopes that you would commune with us. We pray this in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, so great divorce. We finished chapter 9, and I made the mistake last week of saying that we would not do chapter 10. That's not, it's the first part 11 that we'll maybe come back to at a different time when maybe we're in the Gospel of John or something. 10 has to do with this person, this ghost that grumbles, complains all the time, and it's a very short chapter. And what's interesting is that even when people try to get that particular ghost to consider something else, this one can't, and is insistent upon their own way, which is a form of self-rule, pride. That's a common theme that shows up in our book, in our story. And so at the end of it, she just pops, which is, you can open that to whatever interpretation you want to, for that, but the last sentence, or the last two sentences are interesting to me. It says, the ghost, this is in chapter 10, the ghost, which had towered up like a dying candle candle flame snapped suddenly. A sour, dry smell lingered in the air for a moment, and then there was no ghost to be seen. And that thus ends chapter 10. And I wouldn't read into the popping. I just think that to take this whole concept of personal choice and how choice can lead to another choice and lead to another choice and lead to another choice, and before long a person can become so far from where they can't even see another way. This would be the extreme version of that, where it ends. And I don't, the popping, who knows? I mean, I wouldn't read anything into some theological significance there, as much as just this. In chapter 10, this person is just bent on having her own way, particularly when it comes to either what she talks about all the time, her duty, what she did her duty, and even when Hilda tries to bring her back over and over and over, she is just bent on that it's going to be her way or the highway, for lack of better words, and she's just works up and pops. So.
I thought about when a person that complains all the time, and when they leave, even when they leave your presence, I thought about that smell. I thought how you hear that they left a bad taste in your mouth.
Yeah, well, that's a good analogy there. What she said was that someone who just constantly complains, and when they, even when they leave your presence or wherever they're in the room or whatnot, that it just lingers. And she made the connection of a bad taste in your mouth. Perhaps this is a bad taste in your nose, or a bad smell in your nose. So, well, there is a level of self-righteousness. All that is. Notice how self comes before all that, whether it be self-consumed, self-righteousness, her way or the how. All that is dependent upon just who she is, and not anything else. And if you go back and look at what actually takes place, this is dictating policy all throughout other people's lives. And even when that policy is negatively affecting other people, just cannot see that. And which is a side effect of we've already looked at some of this, and in 11, 12, and 13 we'll see some more of this. Pride, self-pity, things of that nature that are tied to this self-rule, it does prevent seeing clearly, for lack of better words. But 10's it's a pretty short chapter and doesn't end well for this ghost, and she's the only one that pops. There are others that, some of them they go back to the town of hell. Some we don't know how it ends. C.S. the narrator and George MacDonald are only able to, they eavesdrop for a period of time and then they leave to go on to something else. And so we don't know exactly how that ends. One that we don't know is this, how he begins chapter 11, the most painful meeting. And that is where it looks like a mother lost a son at some point, and how that conversation takes place. And it ends, that little discourse in the middle of chapter 11 ends with, we don't know how it's going to happen. And what MacDonald says is that there's a lot more conversation there. And then we move into what I think is a great part of the book. I mean, just a fantastic analogy for us. And that is this guy with a lizard. And it takes place on the second half of chapter 11. And what I think is interesting about the person with the lizard is I think it gives us insight into how change can take place inside of a person. Now, if you're just to kind of jog your memories back with what's going on, Lewis and MacDonald, or if you can imagine, standing off a pathway, and here comes this guy with this lizard on his shoulder, and he is confronted by an angel, or what looks like an angel. And they witness this conversation. And I think what goes on in this conversation is important for us when it comes to changing or transformation or whatever it may be, and whatever term you want to put with that. And that is, in the beginning of that conversation, there is the man is pretty hard and fast with not recognizing that the lizard is actually a problem. And there's 8 times in the text, in the story, that the angel asked the man, if you want me to get rid of the lizard. Sometimes it's, shall I kill it? Do you want me to silence it? Do I have your permission? But there's 8 times the angel asked the man about, I can get rid of this if you want me to. And I think the first 3, there is a failure to even acknowledge that the lizard is a problem. And so the man or the ghost comes up with, I told, that he's not a problem. I told the lizard if we came here that he was going to have to be quiet, and yet the lizard is not willing to be quiet. At one point, the ghost actually looks at the lizard and tells the lizard to shut up, and the lizard just still keeps going on and on. And so at some point, if we were to extrapolate this into our own life, at what point, or at some point in change that takes place inside of a person, there has to be first this acknowledging that there really is a lizard. Now, the lizard is lust in the story. We find out that later on, but the lizard could be anything, all right? So, I mean, we'll talk specifically about lust in a minute, but if we are going to change, and C.S. Lewis isn't the only person to come up with this. I mean, you can look at 12-step programs. You can look at all kind of things. That this idea of, first there has to be an acknowledgement that there really is an issue, and why is that so difficult for people, or why do you think it's difficult? Sure. All right. Because in order to admit, she said that pride could be an issue. In order to admit that there is a problem, not only does it require a level of honesty, but it requires an admittance that, either I can't control this, or this is, something wrong with my character or my behavior or whatever, however you want to classify it. It's humbling to admit that, we might have a lizard on our shoulder. Who wants to do that? That's one aspect that I've learned in ministry that we really don't like. We might do it in private, but I don't see many people walking around with a big old sign that says, "Yes, I have a lizard, and here it is." We just don't like to admit that, and it's a level of maybe it's we come up with levels to justify that, but at some point there has to be some level of admittance. That's one of the reasons why confession can be not just important, is so powerful. And when someone confesses, all right, and we can talk about different ways of confession, but what is powerful about confession is when somebody, there's just something about saying it, that it moves from off the shoulder here to out here, so that it goes from being subjective to objective. That's one of the ways that confession can be very, so therapeutic. And there are other aspects of that are important, but what I've discovered in my own life, and I'll just speak first person, is in confession that the moment I say it, whether I know it or not, that begins the process of healing or transformation or changing, because I can't take it back. If that makes sense? There's a wonderful passage that Jesus, in the Gospels, where Jesus says, "Don't cast your pearls before swine." You know what that means? Don't air all the dirty laundry on Facebook. It is not helpful. All right. It needs to be with a trusted friend. It needs to be with, someone that obviously understands that they're holding pearls. Okay. But it can be helpful, and confession, in my experience, for change to be lasting and to be effective, it has to start with this acknowledging that it is an issue. Now, whatever it is, all right. It might not be lust, or it could be something else. But I also know that, at least about myself, and what I've observed about people in general, is we all have lizards from time to time, and the first step in getting rid of that does require some level of admittance, just acknowledging that there is a problem. Now, that could be a process. Maybe in the beginning, it's not actually confession where you speak about it, but at least you're beginning to have some level of reflection inside of your own life to even say to yourself, yeah, this is becoming an issue. Maybe you're not ready yet to actually admit it to someone else, or a therapist, or a trusted friend, or an accountability partner. But at some point, there has to be a level of reflection that says, "Wow, there actually is a lizard, and the lizard is calling the shots of my life." And it happens, and it happens to so many. So the first step would be is this level of acknowledging that there is a problem. That's what eventually the guy gets to that point, And so when we're looking at the conversation between the angel and the ghost with the lizard, it goes from acknowledging that there is a problem now to considering the question of, do I want to journey down this path that leads to change? And notice how the conversation changes from, yeah, the lizard's here, to, well, if we're going to get rid of the lizard, is that going to be painful? Is it going to be painful for the lizard? Is it going to be painful for me? And so some of the conversations that take place between the ghost and the lizard is, is this going to hurt? And how does the angel, what answer does the angel give?
I never said I wouldn't hurt you, I said I wouldn't kill you.
That's exactly right. So does change, how fortunate, right? That just happened to look down and there it is. Change, in my experience, normally involves some level of pain, because it's change. By nature, we like homeostasis. We like to stay inside whatever pattern that we're in. And so if you study systems theory, and that is how as an organization changes or a person changes, one of the ways for an organization to change is to inject pain inside the system, because that makes them move off status quo. As out of the comfort zone. That's exactly what it is. And if change was easy and did not involve any levels of pain, then whatever the lizard is wouldn't be a problem, because we wouldn't have a lizard, right? Does that make sense? But the fact that change does require something of us, and often can be painful, some people, even after acknowledging that the problem is still there, in the whole, what I call the considering of the question, will choose to stay in their place and just live with the lizard. Because the effort that it takes to change, for whatever reason, is either painful or too great of a journey that somebody wants to travel. And we see...
And in the media, you see at that point where people become proud of it or act like they're proud of it.
Yeah, the question is that some people at that point, instead of pursuing change, it becomes like a badge of honor for them. That they become proud that they have a lizard, and that that could be a way of justifying it, because the powers of justification are, they're pretty strong. I can justify all my actions. I don't know about you, and they're pretty good arguments, And we've discovered that my son has the green gene, and which is the powers of persuasive justification, and more so than his sister. And but it's amazing how that manifests itself. Of course, I like to blame Brooke, so I can justify my own self, right? But think about it. I don't necessarily want you to share this, but think about in your own life, whenever confronted with things that you would like to change about yourself, whether it be conviction from God, whether it be someone puts their finger on it, how we can spin webs of justification. It really is pretty powerful. And all of it is to, sometimes justification is to get the focus off my lizard that's on my shoulder. And so that's what the man does. Is it going to hurt? Yeah, absolutely. Well, what about the lizard? I don't want to be cruel to the lizard. I don't want to be. I don't want myself to hurt. And but eventually, the guy comes to the conclusion that yes, it will be painful, but it's worth the risk. and he's willing to risk and endure the unknown, however painful this is going to be, because he doesn't know at this time. Now, we have the luxury of hindsight, of going through the story and then looking back. But put yourself in the guy's place. At that point, all he is assured, as Betty has pointed out, is that he won't die, but that it will be painful. And so eventually the angel asks again, I think it's maybe number 5 or 6 or 7, shall I kill it, or do you want me to, get rid of it? And eventually he says yes. All of that, these first 2 steps of acknowledging that there is an issue, and then considering that it's worth the risk of the pain or the unknown for the possibility of something that can be better. Eventually he gives up control, and that's critical for us, particularly when it comes to God. What sits at the heart of every one of these ghosts is this idea for self-rule. And so eventually, for one to embrace heaven in the story, or what we were talking about when it comes to change, at some point we have to be willing to give up control. Now, you've heard all kind of Christian cliches, let go, let God, things like that. And they're nice little catchphrases, but what they seek to try to explain is that at some point, we do some things, we acknowledge a problem, we consider the question, and then eventually is, all right, God, I really do want to take those steps that lead to change. And there's a level of giving up of control of that where it's a level of trust, it's a level of faith, and eventually, once that happens, then, of course, to the story, the angel comes in, puts his hands around the lizard, and changes it. And what happens to the lizard? Turns into a beautiful horse, right? A stallion. Or a filly, I guess. We really don't know. And then what happens to the man? Or the ghost? Mm-hmm. He becomes whole and gets on the horse and rides up to the mountaintop. Now, what's getting on the horse and riding to the mountaintop? What's that got to do with anything? Well, redeemed.
He's in control, he's overcome.
Sure.
He's on top instead of being underneath.
Right.
He's on top.
It's a good image there where instead of the lizard being on top controlling, now he's got a mastery of things that are going on. How about people too? I think those are all good insights. The only thing I would add too would be, how about people who have journeyed through something and they know fully what it's like to have the lizard on their shoulder. They know what it's like to acknowledge that there is an issue. They know what it's like to endure whatever, the pain that it takes to change. And their life has changed. And so they've journeyed through all that and they've come out on the other side, and then they become a helper to somebody else. And so what once was a lizard now can become something that is like a horse, a source of strength. Not to where they're wearing it like a badge to justify it, but like you see this in AA. Sponsors. What are sponsors in AA? That's exactly. They're people that have journeyed through, and then they go back and help people on the front end, right? There's a part that shows up in 2 Corinthians. I think it's in the first chapter. I want to say around verse 11. Don't hold me to that text. I'll research it and send it back, or next time we meet, tell you if that was the right text or not. But it talks about our past experiences that have been redeemed, our past experiences that have been what we call regenerated. And that's a theological word there, which means that they've been changed. They're no longer calling the shots, but we don't forget about them, but they become a witness to someone else who might be going through that, and it can also be a point of encouragement and aid. And so this is what I think is going on in the text. That this guy walks into this new existence or lives into what the change will be. And notice that the lizard didn't evaporate like the ghost in chapter 10. The lizard just gets transformed into something else. And it becomes something of beauty. And I would argue that it becomes something of an encouragement.
It's like sharing the gospel with someone.
Right?
And then when you've accepted Christ and you know the joy, then you pass it on, and then they become a new creature.
Right. What she's saying is that, when someone becomes a Christian and they go and share their life with someone else, and I mean that's an inviting aspect to where they see either the levels of joy or the levels of forgiveness, how the gospel has had its effect inside of your own life, that becomes the witness. And I think that's exactly what happens. Minimus Felix, I think that's his name, I think it's 111 AD, said, it's the beauty of our lives that causes people to join our ranks. And he's right. What's that hymn? They will know we are Christians by what? By our love. What? I told the group on Sunday, and I hope the Barna Institute comes out with a better statistic, because it just really hurts my pride. People who come and belong and become active in a church, do you know the percentage of influence that the minister has? Anybody take a stab at it? 20%? You're being very gracious. Thank you very much. 7%. More people come to the church because of music, statistically speaking. I mean, it's a higher percentage, Now, the overwhelming percentage, and it's well over, it's like 68%. You know what the largest influence of people, and that why they're in a church and become active? The people. That's 100% right. They find community. And they see that witness, or they experience that love, and they see people at various stages of the journey. Okay, and this is really important. Various stages of the journey. And they're watching. And so from someone who's on the first step, that person who's on step 5 is really important. And that person who's about to cross the tape and finish, real important. Because it's hope. And it doesn't matter how many times I stand up on Sunday morning and in whatever creative ways John and myself try to come up with this, just talking about it isn't enough. People have to see it. Well, I mean, where are they going to see it? They're going to see it in you. And so this idea, what once was a lizard and controlling, it was like a chain around the guy, around the guy's neck, ends up being a source of strength at some point after transformation. And so I think this part of chapter 11 is very important aspect in the story. This is, I think, now I'm going to have to go back and look at my notes. I think this is the only one that you actually see journey up into the mountain. The other ones were, one of them, some of them go back, one of them pops, some of them it's yet to be determined, but this is the only one we see that actually journeys up into the mountain. Now, if we're reading, we don't know anything about this, but just the story that we're reading, that's fairly significant. Well, I think you can see aspects of how that would even play out inside of someone's life. And it starts with acknowledging that it's there, not hiding from it, to the best of our ability, understand that it's not going to be easy, but it's worth the risk, giving up control, and then allowing God to work with the person to bring about something that's different. And then walking in that process. And I think that is, to see a life change, to me, it is the greatest witness that we could ever give for the Lordship of Christ. And the only life that you have control over is your own. So what you do with your faith and your interaction with God is the witness to others. Now, there are degree. Somebody's.
I was going to say, I think the fact that Gloria and I have lived together so peaceably, you know, Mother just brought us up to get along, you know, and we're not selfish with each other. We've lived together a long time now, and it's working really
Sure.
well.
Yeah, living together is not easy. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're sisters or friends, spouses. I mean, it just that's hard work. I mean, when unless you can do, like when I was growing up, I don't know if y'all did this with your children, but early in my younger brother and I are only separated by, I think it's 16 months, and so we played in the same leagues growing up. The rule was we couldn't be on each other's teams because we fought so much. And so he would be on one team, I would be on another team. And, being so close developmentally, we were, about the same size. I was a little bit taller. And for a small period of our life, we shared the same room as little boys. And we fought so much that I remember my parents putting a line down the middle of the room that this was Shane's side and this was Trey's side. And, I don't know if you ought to do that or not. But learn, living with someone, sharing space, is... What's that? She's not here to see it? Well, we had one of those too. I mean, one could sit... station wagons back then were, the SUVs. And so one had to sit in the back and one had to sit in the second seat, but we couldn't sit behind each other because then, you could hit. So, it had to be catty corner, and...
Mine was worse. My sisters put a line down the middle of the back seat, sedan. They had each their side. They put me in the floor.
Yeah, back then, yeah.
All the way to Raleigh, North Carolina, several times.
Yeah, well, it's so to be able to do that peacefully is you got to give up a lot of control, unless you divide it up, with a line. So, and to Gloria.
Jess is going to come soon because I think her daughter is going to move in a few years from Savannah.
Right.
And then we'll see.
Well, we got Shuby. That's your dog, so Shuby will keep the peace. But but how we live it is the witness, and whether you acknowledge this or even agree with it, it really doesn't matter. People watch what you do, and and there are degrees of influence. It's normally those as closest to you see they get the front row seat, and then there are people who maybe have seat number 2 and on down the line. But your life is the witness. That is the overwhelming 68% of the people who are drawn to church are drawn from other people. Only 7, again, cuts me deep, All right, let's take about a 5-minute break, and then we're going to move into Sarah Smith and Frank. being. At that part of their life that is so much a part of our identity, which is sexuality. What makes dealing with lust so elusive is that it emanates from our deepest need and our deepest desire, which is love. But it gets distorted and it gets twisted. Persons who are trapped in sexual sin are trying so hard to be loved and to love. And lust fuels a distortion of that. So it can be very difficult for us. It's so close to love and yet so far from love. Sexual longing or passion or desires, they are not sinful at all in and of themselves, actually God-given throughout the Scriptures. It's when they become uncontrolled and excessive that they can be destructive. And lust is one of the reasons why early on in the church's history, there's a reason why it's listed among one of the 7 deadly sins, is because it can be very difficult, and because it starts with something that's good and it distorts it to a point to where it moves us in directions and areas where we just don't want to go. All right, so now we're going to move on to good old Sarah Smith and her husband Frank, and his carry-on baggage. Sarah Smith, actually, with word count and the amount of material that it is in the book, this is the largest conversation among any of the ghosts. The bishop was the second largest. You might remember him from chapter, I think, 4 or 5, or the Episcopal ghost. But the interaction between Sarah Smith and Frank is the largest discourse that we're able to see. Now, what's interesting about Sarah is Sarah Smith. How do we first meet Sarah? She has an entourage, doesn't she? Yeah, I mean, that's one of the few, right? I mean, it's like a parade. You see all these people coming before Sarah, and then all kind of building up, and then you get to Sarah. And the narrator asked George MacDonald, said, "Who is this person?" And of course he paints this picture of how wonderful Sarah is, and she was a nobody here on earth, but in heaven she's fantastic. And you can see elements of the gospel there. First shall be last, greatest in heaven, least of these. And yet, how do we meet Frank? What do we know about good old Frank?
Well, he's two beings.
Yeah, is Frank the tall actor type person, or is he the? Yeah, he's the little one, and he's full of self-pity. And now I know that's not an issue for anybody in our day and time. This is, again, remember he wrote this back in the middle 1900s. And Frank and Frank's biggest struggle is Sarah's condition. He's jealous of it. She is happy. We discover that she loves Frank, but she doesn't miss Frank, and yet Frank is he's basically put off by this. And then what is the first thing she does when she sees Frank? She goes to him and says, "If I've ever done anything to hurt you, I want you to forgive me." And so forgiveness flows out of her, and yet what does he do when she asks that, or when she makes those statements? It has to deal with a stamp. Do you remember that part of the story? A stamp. He recalls the time. the stamp. Yeah, where there was only one stamp in the house, and he, sacrificially, selflessly gave the stamp to her so that she could write her mother, but never once did she say anything about if he wanted to write somebody and maybe he wanted to send a letter to someone. He immediately talks about how unselfish he is, and yet how selfish she was to ask even for the stamp, which is fascinating, isn't it? Especially when it comes to people who struggle with self-pity. Frank is blinded to a reality because he only wants to see certain pieces of reality. All he sees is that she took the stamp, or she asked for the stamp, or whatever it may be. She wrote the letter. She mailed the stamp, and he only sees that portion of it. He doesn't see all the other ways that his life had been hurtful to other people, or even how selfless she was in their life. And what happens when Sarah identifies the real issue with Frank? When she actually goes up to him and says, "Frank, stop being selfish and stop using pity to manipulate other people." What does he do? He gets smaller. Yeah, he sure does, and which is interesting. And one of the things that here, this is what can happen inside of family dynamics or in relationships. Pity can be used to manipulate other people. Right?
Yes. I really like, I can't find it, I thought I underlined what he said about pity was a spur
Right.
to, I really like you to tell that. I did think I underlined it, it was.
I'll have to go back and look. I don't.
Okay, it says pity was meant to be a spur that drives joy to help misery.
Right.
I thought that was, if you use pity correctly.
Yeah. What page are you on?
I'm in this book,
Yeah.
130.
130. If you have the red book, it's on page 131. Self-pity is a derivative of pride, and it twists the sense of self. Self-pity works against a healthy understanding of self. It's blinded to the reality because it only wants to see certain pieces of what's actually there. Now, the reason why this can be so destructive is because what is the lens or the measure by which we are to love and care for other people? When Jesus is asked, how are you to care and love for other people? What answer does he give? That's exactly right. Where's my stuff? Oh, here we go. Yourself, how you love yourself and care for yourself is to be the determining factor by which you love and care for other people. Well, pity, self-pity, this distorts who you are to the point to where you are either better, higher, whatever word you want to use to classify yourself, than other people. And so often, people who struggle with pity, this sense of self-pity, and use it as a way of manipulating other folks, the reason why that can be so destructive inside of relationships is because others are reduced to things. You can use people. And if you don't see people the same way, if you're greater, that's not a cross, that's a plus sign. All right. So if you are, maybe we'll go back to greater than, less than. Remember that? So greater than, if you see yourself greater than others, then others are lesser than, right? Well, if a person is not a person, what are they then? A thing. Right. And so so the reason why self-pity can be so just difficult to deal with inside of relationships is because one person is elevated at the expense of others. Well, the way Jesus describes how we are to care for people and how we are to love other people is that how you love and care for yourself should be the means or the way or the measure by which you care for other folks and love other folks. Well, if you're elevated, you can't. If you're elevated over others, you can't elevate. Only one can be elevated, right? I mean, if I think I'm better than everybody else, then that's right. I'm at the top. So how am I going to care for? I mean, how then will I see other people? Right. That's exactly right. And so you have this going on inside of Frank, and the reason why, I mean, self-pity can be, you don't even see reality clearly. You definitely can't see how you are affecting other people. And my glasses broke, sorry, and I tried to tape them. Obviously, it's not working. And my vision has gotten to the point where I can't see this far anymore. So, self-pity itches for recognition, and it feeds a part of, almost like a black hole. And so people exist to feed, that void that's inside of a person's life. I think there are 4 things that show up with pride and self-pity that are important. And let me see if I got those. Yeah. The first one is we can only see the good and perfect in ourselves. And we struggle to see the good and perfect inside of other people. Again, think back to how Jesus' words, if you are to love and care for yourself, and that becomes the means by which you love and care for other people. Well, if you're the good and the perfect one, then the odds are you will treat others less than that. And not only that, you think highly of yourselves. And normally when that happens, you make assumptions about others, and yet we expect them to cater to our desires. That's that feeding of that hole, and it can manifest itself in people being reduced to just pawns on the table for you. It prevents us from giving attention to other people. I mean, Frank cannot give any attention but to himself. And so think about people, I hope not in your life, okay? So, I mean, I hope this is, we're just talking about the story. But maybe think of another story, or maybe think of, someone who lives 10 states away, how that plays out in their life. Where, I mean, it's consuming life and energy from others, and it constantly does that. Passive aggressive. All right? Do not raise your hand. Okay? If you are passive aggressive, you know what passive aggressive means? All right? Being passive aggressive people flirt with this. And it's a backhanded way to draw to yourself. And it's so if you are passive aggressive, just look down, so, and don't write it down on your paper or something. Somebody might see it. But we might want to go back and read chapter 11, 12, and 13. So yeah, I was going to say let's go back. First thing is to realize that anyways, we're kind of off track, and we don't want to end it on a bad note, right? So, but it stemmed from this idea of other people exist for you. And if you are perfect and good, not perfect and good as the way that the Bible interprets a person, but you see yourself as being perfect and good at the expense of other people, over other people, well, obviously, they're the ones with problems. You're not. So when it comes to acknowledging that there's a problem, or when it comes to confession, or even when it comes to repentance, we're not the ones who have to repent. Right? So we don't have any problems. Now you, on the other hand, did any of y'all ever listen to the book? Am I the only one that did that?
No.
Yeah. Oh, you did? Okay. John, I think everybody in here knows John Few. If he's watching, tune him out, Slade. I don't want him to go to his head here. He turned me into this little app that it's got like 40,000 books, and one of them is A Great Divorce. Well, I like to listen to books, particularly when the whoever it may be, the speaker, it's normally not the author, plays all the voices. Well, the one that does this one is fantastic, because whenever it talks, whenever the actor or the what do they call it? No, the tragedian or something. Yeah. And so he, whenever he speaks, it's in this. It's like one of those over actors. You ever see them? Well, you didn't give me a stamp for, it's just like sucking energy out of people, and so I'm not the one that's wrong, and you're the ones that took advantage of me. I was very selfless. I wanted the stamp, so I don't need to confess. Now you need to go and confess, Sarah, because you took the stamp, right? That's what happens. And the way it manifests itself in relationships so often is through being passive aggressive, and it's very difficult. Now, do you know how to deal with passive aggressive? Does anybody know? Well, avoid them. That is a way. You actually address it head on. And Sarah Smith, what does she do when she sees Frank? Stop doing this. That's how you do. If there are people that you're in a relationship with that have that use passive aggressive type behavior, the way, if you really want to change it now, Slade's got a good point. You might not want to deal with it, all right? So then, just turn the other cheek, walk away. But if you actually do want to address it, you meet it head on, and you call it for what it is. Now that doesn't work on everything, but with passive aggression, it does. And but now be ready, because does Frank say, "Oh, thank you, Sarah, for telling me about this. I've struggled with this for so long, and yet you've been so very helpful for me." And no, what happens? He actually gets smaller, and in relationships, the best way to deal with passive aggressive behavior is to not sugarcoat it, but to actually say, Sue, do you know what you're doing? This is what this is you're being passive aggressive. Let's think of a better. You don't skirt the issue. But Frank can't. He can't see anything other than what's right around him. Do what?
I said that hasn't been my experience.
Yeah.
I don't believe anybody's passive aggressive will admit it.
Well, no, but what it does,
Or recognize
it changes. No, I'm not. Now you can't control how they'll respond, but what'll happen is there'll be equality back in the relationship.
Take their power away.
Right, exactly right. And here Frank wants the authority in the relationship, and he uses passive aggression to manipulate Sarah. And so the way Sarah gets out of that is by saying, "Stop it." But now we don't. How does this end? Do they get on the horse and ride up to heaven together? So you can't control how the other person will respond, but the way you get yourself untangled is by addressing it head on. Now whether or not somebody changes, you cannot control that. All you can control is your response. And so your response to passive aggression is, "No, I'm not going to deal with this."
Almost when she met him, the forgiveness.
Right.
Sorry. That was almost feeding
Sure.
need
It could be,
to
yeah.
apologize to. and
Right.
Be catered to.
Right. But her next comment is, stop manipulating. So I mean, but it does feed some of that, or it can be. And so again, the way you deal with it is more head on. Now, the odds are this relationship doesn't end well. He actually gets smaller and smaller and smaller till you can't see him anymore. And but just the way you deal with that is just head on. Now, Martin Luther, I love Martin Luther, one of my favorite persons to study in the church history. And one of the reasons why I like Martin Luther is if you're looking for somebody in the church that always made the right decision and is the picture of holiness, he's not it. I mean, Martin Luther's brilliant and very courageous, but he's what we call incredibly earthy. Now, I don't mean earthy as in eating granola and wearing flip-flops and hemp clothing and stuff like that. He's earthy in, he's got a lot of old man, to use the Corinthian language, that's still in need of, transformation. If you read his writings, and he's fantastic on a lot of things, but boy, he can get out there sometimes. So, but Martin Luther said this, I think it's brilliant. The only thing that resists the idea of justification, what he means by that is justification by faith, is the pride of the human heart. And to some extent, every ghost in the story, whatever their issue is, you can boil it down to this understanding of self-control, self-rule, however it manifests itself. And for Frank specifically, he cannot humble himself and even accept love or to even accept forgiveness. It's just something inside of him that will fight at that. I think there's something that sits, inside the human heart that wants to resist the will of God. And part of the whole transformation process, and I think it's an act of the Holy Spirit, is putting that to bed. Wesley, the way Wesley described transformation, he said the things on the outside, like behaviors, things like that, he said that those can easily be changed. Normally, if you have somebody with accountability, that's working, that those can change. It's easier to change them than it is to deal with the root of the issue, which is what's inside of our own heart. He said that's harder, and I think he's right. And which I think Luther is, even though Luther was a couple hundred years before him, he's spot on. The only thing that resists the idea of justification is the pride of the human heart. And so there's something inside of us that at some point has to say, all right, God, I'm not going to fight you on this. I'm going to tap. I'm going to give in. And I, it might take me some time to have that manifest itself in my life, but I'm going to acknowledge that it's there, and I know that it's going to strike at my core of how I see myself, and it's going to strike at this core of wanting to not submit or to not, I'm going to put my defenses down. And I'm however it is that your Holy Spirit works inside of a heart, I want you to do that inside of mine. And I'm going to stay with it until it has its effect. I'm not going to do a little one and done, do a little lip service, or maybe spin it to where I can justify it. I'm going to see that all the way through. And I think that's how the Holy Spirit works. And it ends up, when the moment that the tide turns, I don't know. But all of a sudden you realize that the fight against the will of God is not, you're not so dogmatic with it. And eventually it becomes easier and easier.
I think you quit struggling.
Sure, yeah, that's right. The fight against it. She said, you think you quit struggling. That's right. I mean, putting the fences down. The idea of, and what is written into faith, Christianity, a life with Jesus Christ, it is submission. And if we cannot submit, we're going to have a hard time with God. And because it has to deal with wanting to push against the wall. And at some point, we're going to have to stop at this. At some point, we have to be willing to see that through. John the Baptist. Not my, here comes, he is better. He must increase, I must decrease. Jesus in the garden. Not my will, but thine. That's our prayer. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. And we will now move on to another book next week, and that will be the Gospel of John. So I invite you to read that. Read it out loud as much as you can. Even if you don't read the whole book from start to finish, at least read a handful of chapters. Read it out loud. The reason we do that is it forces us to read every word, and we start to see some of the chapter breaks. Other than just chapter 1, chapter 2. You see the flow of the argument. All right? Yes?
May I ask you, you let us know about Bobby Gilliland? I just talked to that man yesterday. This just shocked me.
Bobby Gilliland, I think it was around, at some point late yesterday, passed away. And we didn't find out till about 1 o'clock this morning. And so we don't have any information at all other than we just know that he passed away. And so I hope you will pray for his daughters. He has 2. And just for all circles of friends and whatnot. We think he fell and hit his head. And but anyway, pray for them and pray for those that were closest to him. All right, go in peace. May the Lord be with you.